This is a presentation on World War II photographs. In the 1930s, Spain was a country in which landless peasants barely managed a subsistence living by following the harvests on vast, wealthy agricultural estates. When a progressive Popular Front government was elected in February of 1936, promising realistic land reform, conservative forces immediately gathered to plan resistance. The result was a military coup, but the military was unable to take over the country alone, given widespread popular resistance. The military appealed to fascist dictatorships in Italy, Germany, and Portugal for assistance, and they soon began receiving both men and supplies from these countries. Almost from the outset, the Spanish Civil War became a literal and symbolic instance of the growing worldwide struggle between fascism and democracy. The Spanish Civil War, then, can be seen as the precursor to World War II. Photographer Robert Capa photographed the war for Life magazine. The most famous photograph from this war has become known as the falling soldier. Here's a statement about the photograph from Life's website. So yes, it's phenomenally rare for a single photograph to evoke both a discrete moment and an epoch. But that's exactly what Robert Capa's now iconic falling soldier manages to do. There in one frame, in a picture made at the very moment a loyalist fighter in Spain is shot and killed, one encounters a distillation of the fascist violence and the brutally extinguished Republican sense of hope for a new, free, egalitarian society that ultimately came to define the Spanish Civil War. Tensions in Europe continued to rise, and World War II officially began on September 1, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Germany and subsequent declarations of war on Germany by France and the United Kingdom. Italy joined Germany to form the Axis forces. Germany quickly conquered much of continental Europe, leaving the British Empire to fight Germany alone. Germany launched an air attack on Britain, hoping to force it into a quick surrender. The United States, during this time period, remained an onlooker during this early part of the war. While U.S. business interests would have preferred to remain neutral during the war so that they could trade with both sides, the general public tended to be more sympathetic towards the British side, and the photographs coming back from England heightened their identification with the plight of the British. London's St. Paul Cathedral was a symbol of England, like the U.S. World Trade Center towers, the Empire State Building, or the U.S. Capitol buildings in Washington, D.C. And this photograph highlights British persistence and endurance overcoming the darkness and destruction of war. Here's a Capa photo that's entitled Evening Tea in London Air Raid Shelter. Although bombs are presumably dropping above the air raid shelter, the British people are continuing their lives undeterred by the danger. The implication of the photograph is that the British are plucky and courageous, ordinary people who are gallantly bearing up despite the constant attacks from German warplanes. Thus they are worthy of U.S. assistance. In June 1941, the European Axis powers launched an invasion of the Soviet Union, giving a start to the largest land theater of war in history, which tied down the major part of the Axis military forces for the rest of the war. In December of 1941, Japan joined the Axis forces, attacked the United States and European territories in the Pacific Ocean, and quickly conquered much of the Western Pacific. Here you see the attack on Pearl Harbor. The American public saw a few of the photographs taken in Pearl Harbor at this time. The destruction was thought to be too great to share these images with the American people. The U.S. quickly moved to a wartime footing, increasing the movement of war materials to Britain. Recruiting civilians into the armed forces, as you see here. And training them for combat. The first U.S. soldiers arrived in England in 1942. Photos from World War II often highlight the positive relationship between the U.S. military and the civilian population. I think it's quite clear here. Here's another image of a U.S. soldier helping out a civilian, in this case in Tunisia. The visual imagery of American soldiers coming to the assistance of local people was not continued into some later wars, notably the conflict in Vietnam in the 1960s. This photograph was taken by Eugene Smith, who later risked his career to support the New York Photo League, as I think you have learned already in this course, when they were accused of being a subversive organization. Smith was covering the war in the Pacific for Life magazine, and this photograph shows an American Marine lifting a nearly dead infant from a cave where native islanders had been hiding during the battle for Saipan and then bombed. Despite the apparent care and concern of the soldier holding the baby, it died soon after. Note Kappa's camera angle here. The pilot looks in full control, and the expression on his face suggests this as well. And we're looking up at the pilot. At the side, on the side of the plane, he has marked the number of planes that he has shot down. The previous photograph was taken in Tunisia, part of the North African campaign. Although the Allied forces did poorly against German and Italian troops at the beginning of this campaign, eventually the numerical superiority of the Allies led to their victory there. From Tunisia, the Allies were able to cross the Mediterranean into Sicily, and Kappa went along with them. Notice the difference in style between the World War I photograph in the top left and Kappa's World War II photograph in the bottom right. With his more lightweight camera and faster film, Kappa was able to move with the soldiers, getting close to the action and getting shots of events in motion, which was really not very possible during World War I. The cameras were much too bulky to make this possible. Here's another photograph by Kappa that you can see he's really quite close to the action, and we have a sense of immediacy that we don't get with World War I photographs. These action shots often ended up in the pages of Life magazine and even on the covers. Here's another photograph from the same issue, also by Kappa. U.S. photographers took photos of wounded U.S. soldiers, but they were careful to show that wounded men were being promptly and competently cared for. After fighting their way north from Sicily to Italy, the Allies felt ready to launch a major offensive in northern Europe, landing on the coast of France on July 6, 1944, in what was known as D-Day. Here you see General Eisenhower speaking to soldiers on the eve of the invasion. Kappa accompanied the first wave of soldiers as they stormed the Normandy beach. The account of Kappa's experiences and the subsequent fate of his photographs is well told in the documentary Robert Capa in Love and War, which is available to you in this week's folder. So the only thing I'll add is that Steven Spielberg referenced these images in the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan. Here are more of the photographs that Capa took that day. Whether he meant to or not, the blurry quality of the images adds to the sense of urgency and danger conveyed by the pictures. As Capa continued east across France towards Paris, he shot images of French people who had collaborated with the German occupiers being punished by fellow citizens. Here's a photo, not by Capa, of the execution of a Nazi collaborator, taken at the moment of the bullet's impact, which has caused the man's body to recoil so strongly that it has snapped the rope that had fastened him to the pole behind him. If anything, this image is even more dramatic than Capa's previous photograph of the Spanish loyalist soldier being shot during the Spanish Civil War. Eventually, the Western Allied troops, coming from the west, and the Soviet troops fighting their way from the east, met in Berlin, and the war in Europe was over. This famous photograph was taken by the celebrated Russian photographer Eugene Kaldi. And you see, we have a Russian soldier who is planting the Soviet flag here at the top of the Reichstag, the symbol of German government and stronghold of German authority, which really is a symbolic gesture showing the fact that Germany really has fallen. Margaret Bourke-White was also traveling with troops for Life magazine, and she captured this dramatic photograph of Dr. Kurt Lissow, Leipzig's city treasurer, and his wife and daughter who took poison just before the U.S. tanks rolled into the city. As a high-ranking official, he would have been tried and punished. In the closing moments of the war, Nazi propagandists told the German people to expect savage treatment from the Americans, and there were a number of suicides like this. Here are two images of death that were taken during the war. On the left, the first to be published in a major periodical, was the one by George Strock, taken of three slain Americans on Buna Beach in New Guinea in 1943. And on the right, you have the last, Capa's photograph of the death of a soldier from a German sniper's bullet on the very last day of the war against Germany, and published in Life magazine on May 14, 1945. While U.S. photographers took photographs of both Japanese and German dead, the images of the Japanese were much more grisly than the ones of Germans, reflecting U.S. racist attitudes towards Asians. This image was taken by Margaret Bourke-White of survivors of the Buchenwald concentration camp when it was liberated by Allied forces in 1945. This photograph was taken in the Pacific. Notice the much more stark lighting in this photo, which was typical of those images taken in the Pacific theater. The look of these photos is much closer to what we will see in the pictures taken in Vietnam 2 decades later. Here's another photograph from the Pacific. This was taken during the week-long battle to secure an atoll in the Marshall Islands from Japanese forces. It's another photograph that foreshadows in its depiction of the emotional and physical strain of battle upon U.S. soldiers, the treatment of war that would come later, this time during the Korean War less than a decade away, when photographers concentrate much more on the emotional toll of the war on the soldiers than they do on sort of presenting triumphs and more positive images of the warfare from the U.S. perspective. Here's another Eugene Smith photograph, one of his most famous World War II images. After photographing the initial landings on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, Smith returned to the island towards the end of the 35-day battle to record the aftermath of the fighting. He photographed engineers blasting the still occupied caves on the Meat Grinder Hill 382, and Life used this image on the cover and dedicated another 9 pages inside that issue to Smith's images. This photograph was taken on February 23, 1945 by Joe Rosenthal. It depicts 5 U.S. Marines and a U.S. Navy corpsman raising an American flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. This photograph was extremely popular, being reprinted in thousands of publications. Later it became the only photograph to win the Pulitzer Prize for Photography in the same year as its publication, and came to be regarded in the U.S. as one of the most significant and recognizable images of World War II, and possibly the most reproduced photograph of all times. Here's some examples. And here's some more examples. Photographs of the mushroom clouds of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki appeared in the next week's issue of Life magazine on August 20, 1945, the issue in which the magazine announced the end of the war. However, images showing the devastation on the ground and on the Japanese civilians caused by these 2 bombs would not be released for decades to come. Back in the United States, civilians and soldiers alike celebrated when the end of the war was announced. And this famous photograph by Alfred Eisenstadt was taken in Times Square, August 14th, 1945. Here's another view.